Hello, welcome to Lawrence County History Corner. My name is Lori. This week we are talking about floods. Most of us are familiar with the 1937 flood. It was considered one of the worst we had in our history. But we actually had floods dating clear back to the 1880s. There was a severe flood in 1884 and 83 that did significant damage. But the first one that is noted was in 1832. Now, at the time, Ironton was actually not even in existence. Most of Lawrence County was rural farms. What was settled, a lot of it still was not. We were, as a county, not even 20 years old, so it was very early on in our history. The flood at the time the Ohio River crested at 61 feet and 1.5 inches. And just a few years later, in 1847, we had another flood. This one was even worse than 32, and it crested at 66 feet and 6 inches. 1883 and 1884 are really the first two floods that we have records of, because they appear in the Ironton Tribune, Ironton Register, because we finally have a newspaper. Ironton, of course, is established, and there also is quite a bit of information about it through Cincinnati and other larger cities. 83 crested at 59 feet and 4 inches. So less than what occurred in 1832 and 1847. In 1884, it was 66 feet 8 inches, which is the worst flood up to that point. An interesting note, at the time, people were reimbursed during this time for flood damages, and if you owned property, if you were a landlord, and actually had rental properties, you didn't receive as much money because they thought you had the money, since you had rental properties, that you weren't as in need as some of the other places. Another fact I thought was interesting is wallpaper was considered a luxury item and also was not replaced when the damages from the flooding was dealt with. The next significant flood, occurred in 1897. So 13 years later, it was 58 feet and 9 inches, and that was actually the lowest flood that we have on recorded in the 1800s. 10 years later, January 1907 and March of 1907, so 2 times in 1907 we had floods. The first one, both crested at over 59 feet. January was 59 feet 1 inches, and in March 59 feet 3 inches. So 1907 was a difficult and rough year. We get 3 years with not significant flooding, and then we have 1910, when we have a 58-foot crest on the Ohio River. 1913 is one of the more significant floods because we now have photographs of those, and there are quite a few of the 1913. In fact, it was kind of thought of as the worst flood we had, and it was true. It was up to that point the worst flood we had ever had in our history, and we had hoped the worst we would ever have. And in 1913, the Ohio River crested at 67 feet 7.5 inches. And then 14 years later, 1927, we had a flood, one of the least, one of the smallest crest, which was 55 foot 4 inches. And then we have 6 years later, 1933, then 3 years after that, 1936. Both times the river crested at 58 feet. 1 inch in 33 and 9 inches in 36. And then the worst flood that we have in Lawrence County history is 1937. To compare to the rest of the floods we'd have over the years, 1937 was the worst. The river crested at 70 feet 6 inches, which up to that point, the worst was 1913 at 67. So it was 3 feet more before the river crested in 1937. As a result of the flooding in 1937, Ironton built the flood wall, and there was other changes made throughout the county to try to combat the flood. An interesting fact, if you go to Marietta, they have a river museum, and outside of that museum, there are markings of where the flood waters reached in Marietta for all the different years. And I found that really fascinating to show just how far up it would go. As far as leaving the marks, the 1937's flooding, you can still see some of the marks on the buildings and the houses and evidence throughout Lawrence County, throughout Ironton specifically. And of course, there's quite a few photographs and articles written about the 1937 flood. It truly did devastate most of our county and the surrounding areas as well. And like I said, it spurred us to look at doing a wall to protect the city of Ironton, and that is where our flood wall came from. It was not, however, the last flood we would have. In February 1939, we would have the first of 2 floods in that year, and the river crested at 57 feet 3 inches. In April, just a short while later, in 1939, the river crested at an estimated 52 feet 6 inches, which would be one of the least that was recorded in Lawrence County history. Now, we have had floods since, some of them more severe than others. The flood wall that was built certainly did play a role, and we are very thankful for the flood wall, and also for the protection that some of us have received over the years. This is just a little piece of Lawrence County History Corner. I hope you enjoy your time with me, and I will see you next time.